My name is Justin Leach. I'm with Troy University. I've been doing research in the area of East Africa and Nile studies for a little while. This pertains to some of what I've been covering, and I'm trying to find a way to reorientate people towards the communal violence that might be a problem as opposed to some of the interstate activity, which has been in the news quite a bit in the last couple of years. There's been, certainly during the presidency, the very short presidency of Ahmed, there was a lot of concern in Ethiopia about some of the language coming out of Egypt as far as the developments that were going on in Ethiopia. It's since I've always been not entirely sure what term to use, but I put in here rapprochement. It's not quite come to that, but the new government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been a bit more accommodating towards understanding Ethiopia's concerns, whereas at the same time he's been putting forward Egypt's as far as the importance of the Nile. So I will be focusing on the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia in this presentation for the most part. If just use this as this. There we are, okay. All right, so a little bit of background on the Nile. There are, of course, many tributaries going down to the Great Lakes of Africa along the White Nile. These are the two main divisions, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The White Nile, very famously, there have been many expeditions down. It's a very wide, slow-moving body of water. A lot of water is lost to evaporation in it. There are some very sluggish areas, particularly in what is now the country of South Sudan. There's one of the largest swamps in the world called the Sud. There's an enormous amount of water that's lost in those swamps to various other small tributaries, lots of evaporation. Most of the water that reaches Egypt through the Nile comes via the Blue Nile. And this is a relatively fast-moving, geographically smaller. It's not quite as wide in most places as the White Nile. But it's very fast-moving, a lot of water coming down from the Ethiopian highlands. It's replenished yearly via the annual rainfalls in Ethiopia. When there is no replenishment, as happened in the 1980s, it can be catastrophic. It was certainly catastrophic for the people of Ethiopia, and also in parts of Sudan, as the expected rains did not come during those crucial years. This is where upwards of 80% of the water that reaches Egypt comes from. It's from that Blue Nile, from Lake Tana and surrounding regions. So it's interesting, in recent years we've seen, of course, with all the upheaval in Egypt, we've seen, and even before that, we've seen Egypt engaged in a lot of international events concerning, of course, since 9/11, the global war on terrorism, and then eventually the invasion of Iraq, and of course the Arab Spring as well. But the real existential threats to Egypt's security have usually come from the south, from Africa. And it's interesting to note that after the Camp David peace accords in 1978, President Anwar Sadat said, this basically takes care of all Egypt's, or I have the exact quote here, the only matter that could take Egypt to war again is the Nile water. It's of course crucial to Egypt. This is something like 90% of the people directly rely on the Nile for irrigation. Most of that water is used for the growing of crops, agriculture, so food and water. Of course, this is it. This is what Egypt needs. Egypt's concern about the Nile has been stated overtly by leaders, and certainly in the recent years we've seen real hostile rhetoric, and this is something that Ethiopia has balked at considerably. And I'll discuss a bit of the tensions there. But securing the Nile has been a constant through the colonial, monarchic, and republican history of Egypt. I mean, you can go back 100-something years, and when the British were active here, of course, full control of the Nile was their imperative. It was something that defined most of their actions in this region. Egypt and Ethiopia have not actually fought about the Nile. Certainly they haven't actually had any conflict of any kind since the 19th century, but it's been very much a concern in recent years. And I'll talk about some of first I'll talk a bit about the nature of what the Ethiopians have in mind. So this is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I may refer to it by the not really attractive acronym of GERD, but this is very often in the literature you'll see GERD. This is how it's referenced. In 2011, Ethiopia announced plans to build 4 large hydropower dams. The Grand Renaissance Dam was the most important. It was directly on the Blue Nile, and this is the one that Egypt has been course, paying the most attention to. Construction's already started. They're working around the clock on this project. You can see, I've seen news broadcasts where at night they have floodlights up, and people are just working through the night. It's breakneck pace to get this dam completed. The expectation date for completion is 2017. It's expected to hold 70 billion cubic meters of water. The reservoir is going to be roughly the size of Lake Nasser in Egypt. And produce about 6,000 megawatts of power. Water has already been diverted but not removed. In fact, in 2013, when some of the water from the Blue Nile was diverted initially, this became a major incident in Egypt. And when news of this hit the Egyptian newspapers, a lot of people who didn't have a lot of background were extremely concerned about what does this mean? Are the Ethiopians already siphoning off our water supply? Egypt's already expressed long-standing concern about the project. Obviously, any major alteration could have catastrophic consequences for them. Sudan's position has been less consistent, and this is interesting. It's, in fact, one of the key moments in this whole debate is Egypt's relationship with Sudan. Sudan generally will side with Egypt on the Nile. Water will see historically that they had an agreement that they both consider to be really the crucial element as far as determining who gets what water. This is two agreements, actually, from 1929 and 1959. But it's really Sudan's wavering on the point of the consistency of upholding these agreements that's been a real problem for Egypt. It's really what's led Egypt to come around to the idea that even if they can't, they may not be able to completely influence Ethiopia to see their way of things. It's much better to rely on dialogue as opposed to saber-rattling. And actually, currently, as we're talking, there's discussion underway to find out a way to agree on surveyors to assess the impact this dam is going to have on Egypt. And Egypt is very much involved in this. For a while, they've been skittish about getting themselves involved, worried that it might legitimize the process. There we are. All right, so here's some of the drama recently I was referring to. We had a series of events between 2012 and 2013, probably not coincidentally coinciding with the administration of Mohamed Morsi. But the first one was something of a coincidence. It was a major dump of documents by WikiLeaks of a global intelligence security firm based out of Texas called Stratford. And one of the leaks that were in these documents was information that Stratford said they had acquired about Sudan and Egypt cooperating on building a runway that they might use for any bombing missions on this dam. The dam should be noted is very closely located to the Sudanese border. It's about maybe 19 kilometers away. So the idea would be that a quick mission across the border could bomb this dam. And this is something that both Egypt and Sudan denied. They said that they had no interest in building these facilities. In June of 2013, we had a meeting chaired by President Morsi. It was put on, broadcast live on national TV in Egypt, presumably without the knowledge of all parties. Some of them later said, some of the lawmakers later said they were not informed that this meeting was broadcast. And you had lawmakers during this session talking about arming insurgents in Ethiopia who might be able to make attacks on this dam, or they might be able to use it as some kind of leverage against Ethiopia completing this dam. President Morsi himself indicated that all options were on the table regarding Egypt's response to the dam's construction. This really happened very soon after Ethiopia started diverting Nile waters, which may have led to the urgency of this meeting and some of the more overheated rhetoric. But it's believed that perhaps this was put on TV as a way to indicate to the Ethiopians by President Morsi, look, I may have to respond to pressure from people about this dam. There's, of course, very much a history of dams being constructed and taking away water and hurting the economies and livelihoods of people downstream. In the Middle East, certainly this happened with the Ataturk Dam's construction in Turkey. During the 1990s, you had countries downstream of the Euphrates like Syria and Iraq having their water taken away from it during the process of the filling of the reservoir there. So there's a immediate history that Egyptians can look to as far as these considerations. And it's, of course, the uncertainty of the project that really bothers Egypt. Egypt's already having water shortages, and occasionally untreated wastewater has been used in agriculture. this can be a real concern, obviously. Of course, Egypt, as it is also, is one of the lowest per capita water allotments in the nation of the world. So they're already dealing with this problem, and as the population grows, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but it's they need a considerable amount more water than they already have. So this is already kind of a problem. That, by the way, is Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, the late Prime Minister of Ethiopia. He died of a heart attack. I really don't know if the exact cause has been revealed, but in late 2012. The dam is sort of his mastermind. He's the one who named it the Renaissance Dam. The idea was that this dam was going to bring Ethiopia back. Ethiopia, of course, has not had a wonderful century in the 20th century. There have been a lot of radical ideologies. Of course, the end of the imperial government, massive famine towards the end of the century. And this is Zenawi, when he declared this project, said this is going to be something that brings Ethiopia back up to the status that it's deserving of. And we'll talk briefly about some of his, what he's referring to by that, if I can. Here we are. I'll go over this very briefly. I don't want to eat up on the panel's time. You had a history. These two agreements are quite important. These are the agreements that allow a quota of almost all of the Nile water to go to Egypt and Sudan. The first treaty that was agreed to was signed in 1929 when both parties to the agreement were effectively under the British thumb. Sudan was governed in conjunction with the British and the Egyptians, and Egypt itself was a monarchy, but of course most of the foreign policy decisions were the responsibility of the British. So this agreement was not really considered to be legitimate by other parties, but even upstream, of course, this was far before independence, and most of the later countries of the East Africa were under British control as well. 1959 was important because this was the agreement that was signed between Egypt and Sudan, as both were independent and free of British control. It increased, actually, the quotas that were allowed to both these countries, and the reason being was because both of them had major dam projects in mind at that time as well. You have the Aswan Dam, which was completed in 1971. The Sudanese were also completing their Los Arias Dam, which was completed 5 years earlier. And so the allotment of more water was in line with the fact that there would be more water for them to share. The most important part about the 1929 agreement that was carried over with the agreement 30 years later was that these two countries had veto power for any states upstream should they wish to develop dams or any kind of irrigation project of their own. What really became, let's see, the 1959 agreement also led to other unforeseen problems in that you had the Emperor of Ethiopia was quite irked by this, and this started a real contentious period between Egypt and Ethiopia as far as the funding of each other's insurgents, and certainly President Nasser of Egypt was active in funding the Eritrean insurgents during that time. You also had President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania basically saying that no East African nation from this point on was going to uphold with any treaty that was signed by the British, or that the British or any other colonial power had been involved in any way. So this was the sort of immediate refusal to adhere to these treaties, even if these East African states were not able to, yet did not have the capacity to act on them in any way that might threaten Egypt's interests. It was really the famine of the 1980s that provoked a lot of ire toward Egypt. This, of course, was when the rains failed. Egypt was protected from the worst effects of this drought, in part because they had the volume of water in the Lake Nasser to rely upon. They didn't get away unscathed. They did have major agricultural problems, but they avoided the massive famine that was associated with the drought in Egypt, in Ethiopia and Sudan. It was really when the rains were restored in the 1990s and President Mubarak decided to act on the plans of President Sadat from the 1970s to create these lakes out in the western desert of Egypt, hopefully expanding the agricultural potential that Prime Minister Zenawi of Ethiopia was really dumbfounded. He said, while Egypt is taking the Nile water to transform the Sahara Desert into something green, we in Ethiopia, the source of 85% of that water, are denied the possibility of using it to feed ourselves. Of course, Ethiopia was restricted by these agreements from any project that would in any way alter the Nile waters reaching Egypt. So this was really what led to a long, slow process whereby Ethiopia would start to enact its rights, it felt, in these, with regard to the Blue Nile water. Ethiopia has long been called the potential water tower of East Africa. Of course, it has a heightened elevation and regular flow of water, not just in the Blue Nile, but various other rivers that flow southward. I'll talk a little bit about the relations between Ethiopia and Kenya regarding that. You also have massive hydroelectric potential. This is, again, something that Ethiopia has only recently been able to fully take advantage of with this very ambitious plan to build these 4 dams. The Renaissance Dam was announced in March of 2011, along with many of these other projects, which are still being constructed, and one of which is almost near completion. I've already discussed how this was so important to Meles Zenawi's legacy for Ethiopia. Ethiopia has problems with development, and this is one of the reasons why these dams are so important, particularly the electricity that can be derived from them. Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, but it's still one of the poorest countries in the world. 85% of the workforce is involved in agriculture or related industries. That might be various forms of textiles, tanneries, what's often called low industry. And Ethiopia is looking to find a way to jumpstart and get into other forms of industry, manufacturing and so forth. But these require, of course, stable sources of electricity, first and foremost if you want to get any kind of sustained investment. So this is really a consideration for Ethiopia, and they need a much more stable source of electricity than they currently have. There's electricity obviously in Addis Ababa, but you have the traditional problems of brownouts and blackouts. This electricity coming from the dam would supposedly neutralize that, and not only that, it would allow Ethiopia to be able to export energy to other countries. They're already doing this to some degree, certainly with Kenya, I think Djibouti as well. But they're hoping to also be able to reach into further into Africa and export energy to Tanzania and so forth. And one of the ways they've been able to pull Sudan over to their side is by promising that they would be able to do the same for Sudan, allow Sudan a source of stable energy that they could rely upon. And this was something that they were able to, as well as a concerted effort to assure the Sudanese that there was going to be no problem as far as how it would affect Sudan's waters. This is one of the ways they were able to pull Sudan away from Egypt's camp on the subject. So Ethiopia's development choices aren't really unlimited here. They have some access to natural resources, gas and oil deposits in the Ogaden region, which is further to the east by Somalia. But they're really relying on manufacturing and other forms of industry to propel them economically. So Egypt in the early 2010s, whatever we're calling this decade, really leaned heavily on its international influence to find a way to slow down Ethiopia's project without having to resort to any kind of military action. They've made sure that this is an international issue. They brought it up so that you have a lot of foreign investors who are very skittish about the project. Certainly the World Bank has. They have a series of restrictions or norms as far as no harm, you can't be harming countries downstream. You also have a situation where they're not really confident that this is an economically sound project. They're worried that it's going to be pulling away available credit from other private investment. Ethiopian banks are going to be leaning towards this. So as a result, the Ethiopians have been very dogged about relying on primarily domestic funding. They've also been turning towards the Ethiopian diaspora, looking to get people to buy loans, and again presenting this as a major event in Ethiopia's history that anyone who's really concerned about their country is going to try and propel forward, even if Egypt has been leaning on these other sources of investment to stay out of the way. You've been having, again, more recently there's been many people in the World Bank have admitted certainly the economist at the World Bank, Lars Muller, who's been kind of overseeing this project and the one who's been sort of warding Ethiopia away from it, has said that in the long term, there is actually a lot of reason to be optimistic about this this project, even if in the short term it is going to be pulling away investment from other sources. I think he said something about it eat up 10% of Ethiopia's gross domestic product at this rate. But in the long term, from the 2020s, after the dam is online, it's active and they're able to start exporting this electricity to other parties. There's reason to be optimistic in Ethiopia. I'll talk very briefly about the Entebbe Agreement. This is an agreement of upstream countries that was reached in 2010. Egypt has been staying away from these agreements, but they've actually, just this month, this is the first time they've actually started attending a lot of the Nile Basin Initiative meetings, which is the upstate countries. And this is reason a lot of people thought that they're kind of coming around to the idea that if we can't beat them, we'll join. We may not be able to get countries to see things entirely our way or to keep in place the allotments of the 1959 agreement, but we may well be able to get them to understand exactly how important the Nile is to us if we're constantly at these meetings and talking about things. Egypt has not signed on to the Entebbe Agreement, which basically proposes removing these allotments entirely. It's basically looking to find a way to reach some kind of common ground here. And I will sort of speed through a bit of this here. Ethiopia's diplomatic victories, I mentioned before Sudan. Starting from 2012, they've been a lot more optimistic towards the idea of this dam. They had a major symposium in 2013 at the University of Khartoum. It was sponsored by the Faculty of Engineering there and Addis Ababa University's Institute of Water Resources. And this is something where basically all questions were fielded, certainly regarding how this dam would affect Sudanese interests. And a lot of Sudanese were quite optimistic about it. You've since had a joining of the three countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, in regular talks. Not regular, they've been sort of halting in recent years. It's called the Tripartite National Committee regarding the Nile, and they've been looking at ways that they can sort of harmonize all their interests here. Again, it's a very difficult process. Egypt is not withdrawing from its initial demands, but it is saying that it's willing to consider things. A major reason for the change of heart has been, I've discussed a little bit about this already, has probably been the assumption of power of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's been trying to find real ways to distinguish himself, not just from Mohamed Morsi, but from the government of Mubarak as well. And a key way to do that is the so-called turn back to Africa. Mubarak in his later years was seen somewhat coldly by a lot of African states because he was seen as not being quite as involved in African affairs as he had been in the past, certainly as previous presidents had been. President Nasser, of course, very famously presented Egypt as a model for all African states to follow. One of the reasons Mubarak did this was because in the 1990s, Egypt had a lot of concerns of its own about terrorism. There was also, during a 1995 trip to Addis Ababa, an assassination attempt on President Mubarak. Some of the individuals involved in this were traced back to the Sudanese government at the time, which definitely chilled relations there for quite a while. President Morsi, whenever he talked about Africa, very often was looking again towards this dam using very antagonistic rhetoric. That may well have been, of course, because he was trying to shore up his nationalist credentials, but also because he was trying to discourage investment in the dam. So it may have been cunning like a fox, but it didn't do him any favors with the Africans. He also didn't visit African states to the degree he made any overseas trips. You have a situation where Sisi is maybe attempting to take advantage of this, of himself as a new leader, and saying, I'm going to be different, I'm going to be paying attention to the concerns of other African states. In return, I ask that they pay attention to our concerns as Egyptians. Very quickly, I'm going to move to potential communal violence. And I won't talk about this too much. Again, it pulls a little bit away from the Middle East nature of this dialogue. But I do want to talk about it to the degree that it is a major consideration that needs to be taken into account as well. One of the problems with these dams may be, and not so much the Renaissance Dam is one of the smaller projects, the Gibbe 3 Dam, which empties into Lake Turkana on the Ethiopian-Turkish border. with any of the development we've seen of these rivers in East Africa, more often you see, as opposed to outright war between states, you see communal violence. This is something that goes back to the Aswan High Dam's creation, where the people of Nubia, tens of thousands of them, were moved out of the way of the Wadi Halfa region to create Lake Nasser. You also had, during the creation of the Meroe Dam in Sudan in 2009, the period leading up to that, you had a lot of violence in that part of Sudan. It didn't make as much news because of what was going on in southern Sudan at the time, and also, of course, Darfur. And you also have in the north of Sudan, again with the Nubians, there's a constant project that Nubians live in fear of called the Kafjar Dam, which has been proposed in 1992. It's never been acted upon, but it's something that a lot of people are worried eventually we're going to have to be moving again. So this is, I think, an area to pay attention to. You have most of this Lake Turkana is in Kenya, but you have a worry that as the lake shrinks and it is growing smaller, the people who live around there can make their livelihoods on fishing. There's going to be a lot of competition over the scarcity of resources. There's a lot of worry about Kenyans, even though their government has signed on to this project, and as a result they feel they're not being well represented. They're worried that people from Ethiopia, the Dasanek people, are going to be moving into Turkana areas and creating problems there. So this is really more an area that people should be looking at as opposed to the more high-profile intrigue. That's really all I have. I don't know if we'll be doing questions after.
I think the questions after.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
This is a very different topic. We've been listening to different people speaking here, and our focus is going to be food security in the Middle East and North Africa. So what's actually happening when we hear these discussions around food security? We're taking a specific grain and we're looking at it, and that's wheat. I'm going to start by giving you an overview of the project, the research that's been going on at Duke, and the methodology that we're using. Our center at Duke specializes in this methodology called Global Value Chain Analysis. I'll explain what that is. Right now, it's just take it as an acronym. And wheat, and then we're talking about the wheat value chain and country cases. So our Minerva project, it's actually been funded by Department of Defense. The Minerva Social Science focuses on identifying different stressors around the world. And also the Army Research Office is working with us on this. The collaboration involves also the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke, where they're looking at various environmental issues and trade flows in the Middle East. The project focuses on ranking food security in the Middle East and North Africa, so we're taking the different countries around the Middle East, and we're evaluating what's going on in terms of food security there in relation to wheat. Then we're applying the GVC approach to look at the vulnerabilities and opportunities in that system and identify key points for what can be done about these commodities, and then we're identifying risks, that's the risks and strategic options. So we all hear about food, and we think of the Tunisian vegetable seller who's in the street and just set himself on fire. We think about Egyptians going into the streets and holding the bread, and it's been a very dynamic issue in that specific region. So the literature tells us in around 2007, 2008, where there is, when we experienced the financial crisis, there was also a food crisis going on where prices doubled, anywhere from doubled around the world. You can see here the different prices for rice, wheat, and maize. This map here tells us a little bit what's been going on in terms of trade and how that impacted trade balance. Usually a lot of countries have, especially in the last 10 years, they've been focusing on importing significant amounts of food from around the world for many reasons. And what we're seeing here, and what our analysis is telling us, that the volatility in certain grains have definitely increased. And it increased because of various reasons. There are a number of complex drivers where we have Russia has become a major exporter to the region. We've seen export bans that, regardless of the trade agreements, global trade agreements that have been around agriculture. And we've also seen tremendous climate change. MENA has high import bill. It's actually one of the highest in the world in terms of importing grain. It's highly dependent, and it does not have enough water or arable land in order to grow its own food. So it's dependent on this. And what that means, it's put a lot of pressure on the fiscal budget. So when we hear about people going to the streets or complaining about food prices, that's because these global food prices, number one, they're imported, so you have to take on your price taker in this case. The transmission of these global prices are very high. And then on the other hand, we have also the government subsidy system that represents a large fiscal burden in these countries. What we did here is we took all the Middle East and North Africa countries, and we wanted to look at what's actually happening if you start using several variables. We based it on the IFPRI analysis with regards to how you identify food secure versus food insecure countries. And when you start looking at these countries, you start having a very different picture from what's known as the Middle East and the MENA region not being very food insecure, but what we found is that it's quite insecure when you have a large number of countries dependent on global markets. We based our analysis on the resource poor, labor abundant, resource rich, labor abundant, and then resource rich but labor importing. They basically do not have enough people in the country to do the work. But what's important about this is that this sort of typology, it gives us an idea about the fiscal ability of a country, that it has foreign exchange, that it can buy food in international markets. So this is why this becomes important as part of the analysis. Then what we did here, we wanted to see, okay, so when we take each country, who are they trading with? And how often and for how long? How important are these trade relationships? And we found out that for Egypt, which represents 25.9%, so most of MENA imports for wheat are actually going towards Egypt. But for Egypt, Syria, and and Libya, they're highly dependent on Russia. And this becomes very important when you take into consideration the fluctuation in Russian grain and also the trade embargo that Russia imposed in around 2007, 2008, and then again in 2010. And what that means when you're having some countries dependent on that, it just means that the prices are going to go up and it becomes very expensive to purchase grain internationally. In addition to this, we looked at Algeria, Morocco, and some other countries, and these are the ones in the red. Except for Tunisia, we found that these countries continued with what we call their colonial or post-colonial sort of relationships. They continued to heavily trade with France. Algeria is a slightly different story where it has a little bit of fiscal space more than other countries in that region. And then with countries that basically have better cash flow per se, we've noticed that they are able to move their sourcing patterns as things change. So Saudi Arabia, Iraq is a little different story, but Saudi Arabia especially mostly depends on Australia in the last few years for its wheat, but it's able to source from the US, from Canada, depending on wherever it can get its wheat from. So now I come to the wheat value chain, and what does that mean? Our analysis, we use the term global value chain analysis, and think of the value chain as a flow chart, trying to flow chart an industry on an input-output basis. There's the global part of it, and that's where we take the geography of that chain. So where is this particular product, or where is that grain coming from? And who are the lead firms? So who's controlling that type, or who are the main players that actually have access to that grain and who are able to move it? And we call these lead firms. And then the governance, what we call the governance structure in the chain. And what that means in terms of our analysis, it means what are the terms of relationships that exist between a firm and a country, or between a global firm and a firm in a local context, in order for trade to exist, in order for trade to happen and these trade flows occur. And then there's the local aspect, which is the bottom up, and that's where we look at institutions, local policies, various dynamics inside that country. What kind of firms are there? What is the potential for this particular country in a domestic context? What are the conditions there, and what are the firms there that are able to capture more of the global value or more of the economic value? Is it able to produce? Is it able to provide, for these products locally, domestically, or regionally? The first step in our analysis, we do what we call GBC mapping, and that's where we look at the system on an input-output basis. We divide it according to activities in production, or what are the activities occurring in that particular sector. Then we start tracing the geography, how it's spread, like I mentioned earlier, and what is the what we call a competitive ecosystem of firms. And what we mean by this, there could be a set of global policies, or maybe like we noticed a lot of the WTO agreements, various conditions that have existed that facilitated the growth, for example, of global firms that are interacting in the grain industry. So we'll look at all of these things, the financing capacity and capabilities there. And then we conduct a stakeholder analysis of firms and organizations. So where you see here, doesn't have where you see here these different arrows, we start listing what's going on under each of these activities, and then we label it. We're populated with data, like could be the names of the firms, it could be numbers that are going on within these firms, or numbers of the quantitative data for the interactions, and then we analyze the governance structure. Are there standards in place? Are there specific conditions for the trade to happen and the flow to occur very well? And then we identify what we call upgrading trajectories. So what does it mean for a country to, that's not, for example, exporting grain, to start exporting grain? Or what does it mean for a country like Egypt, if it's just importing grain, to start having a set of firms to invest in a similar capacity to the Cargills and the Louis Dreyfuses of the world? And we also identify bottlenecks on the local level and on the global level. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the definitions for food security, but what we wanted to do here is figure out in what ways is the GBC analysis contributing? How are we able to provide some information and input and participate in the global discussion about food security? And what we've done here, these are the four main dimensions where the food security discussions have always focused on. The availability of food, so where is it produced, how much of it exists in a particular country or on a global level, the access to it, the utilization, and the stability. And stability in this case could mean, for example, am I able to produce this regularly, but it also can mean, are there conflicts or other situations that exist that impact my ability to access this food or this grain? And we looked at the drivers of food security, and we found out, okay, so for availability, things like production levels, storage, these sorts of things, they impact to what extent is this food available. And then access, things like prices, income, the distribution and the marketing systems that exist within a country. All of this impacts whether someone in Libya or in Syria is going to a bakery and able to buy the bread or not. And then the utilization, the end use, and the diet. And there are lots of shifts that are happening in this area that are impacting how people are eating, what they're eating, and how much of it. The stability, and these are the shocks that I mentioned earlier, weather, markets, and the unrest. And here's where the GBC can tell us a little bit about what's actually happening. We noticed that while taking these top two dimensions did not really predict what happened in 2011. But in order to say a country's food secure, we have to look at what's happening. Who's providing the food? How are we getting the food? How is it reaching the consumer? And what's impacting these prices? And we found that unless we look at the actors and the activities in a bit more detail, then we're able to figure out what's really happening in this food system, and then be able to determine what is the food security outcome looking like in this situation. So the actors, government, farmers, firms, and traders, and these become very critical in wheat, especially the traders. And the geographic scope of it, we look at the domestic and the regional and the international dynamics of it. And we layered this information in the wheat value chain. So when we say GBC mapping, that's eventually one of the looks of it, where we took the inputs, the production levels, the processing, and the marketing. And when we started looking at this, with regards to the input, research and development is really behind in the Middle East and North Africa. There's a lot of work that needs to happen there. With regards to land and water, there are lots of constraints, and we know there were lots of constraints in this side of the chain. And we analyzed, when we started analyzing where is the most critical portion of this chain, we figured out, well, it's actually the processing. It's the important part are these companies here in the trading segment, and these are the ones that are able to move the grain from one place to another. So while the fact that the grain is being grown in Russia or in Nebraska or in Canada, wherever it is, it's actually the Cargills, the Louis Dreyfuses, and all of these that are trading and able to move the grain from the farmer to the country where it needs to go. And it's the ability of these firms to move the grain is what really determines if a country can access that grain or not. And then what determines the flow and how things are working is to what extent government regulations, trade policies, the financial intermediaries, to what extent this government position is with regards to the financial markets, food aid. And then this is something that we put here, futures trading, that became a critical component of food security, which is the trading aspects, to what extent these trading companies have become involved in financial markets, futures, and speculation. The key risk factors that impact food security in the Middle East, and we listed them in this way to sort of give you an idea of what's going on. But what you see here, the important thing is that the constraints, the problems in the region are across that entire chain. They're not specific to one portion of it. So when we start thinking of policies, or when we start thinking about what measures, the prioritization becomes very challenging in this case. The issues of water, land, and the agricultural policies that impact to what extent Egypt is able to produce wheat or not to produce wheat, to make the decision of to produce wheat or potatoes for exports. And these are the things that are in constant tension. The infrastructure is critical, whether a government is trying to grow, whether a country is trying to grow its own food or import it. And we noticed across all the countries, whether they are oil-rich countries or oil-poor countries, they were all having infrastructure deficits. The business environment in the Middle East, all the countries pretty much have that system controlled by the government. It's heavy state control. So the existence of the private sector is not as prominent as you would see in other countries. And the trade and investment, where if you have a situation where trade embargoes exist, like in Syria, for example, at one point, even though food is excluded, but the ability of Syria to import is limited to, number one, its ability to access foreign reserves, and then number two, to interact with international banks so that a company like Cargill is able to export from wherever location, it's at a set price, to Syria. And these types of dynamics, when they evolve, then you see the difficulty about food security and how it's tied into markets and global markets, and the ability for us to be able to look at it from a system perspective will really shed light on what sort of stressors are existing right there and how can we start thinking about it a little differently. This is a map here of the primary ownership to sort of see where things are. And interestingly, Saudi Arabia here was the only state in the region that actually had full control of the elevators level and the mills level. And the elevators levels in the chain that's where you store the grain. But also the access to elevators in the Middle East is not just government. It's not just about government control, but it's also because the governments there are the ones that import, that are in charge of importing the grain. No one else can import unless it's some of the private actors on the side, and that's a different market. That's outside of the subsidized market or the mass access to the bread system. Right now, though, Saudi Arabia is looking into privatizing some of its mills as well. But and with regards to Egypt or any of the other countries, even when you see the both sort of the purple shade, that's after the structural adjustments in so many countries, and UAE is an exception here. But the government is still a dominant player, even though there is private sector presence. The policies, whether it's a price setting for the flour, or price setting for the bread, or the government is still the majority shareholder in these.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to speak about 2 of the 5 cases you saw on the previous slide. We're going to talk about Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So a quick overview of the wheat policy timeline for Saudi Arabia. Up until the 2000s, they adopted what we call a self-sufficiency strategy, so they were able to grow their own wheat. By the 90s, they had become so efficient they were actually exporting wheat out of the desert, which is sort of cool if you think about it. However, water constraints, they depleted their water aquifers, and so they had to switch strategies. So beginning in 2000, they created the Ministry of Water, and they decided that they were going to move to an import-based strategy. And within the next 5 years, they will import 100% of their wheat. To do this, they are also going to have to increase price controls for bread and increase social spending, and this is being done as a way to prevent social unrest within the country. In Egypt, we have a little bit of a different process. So we have this highly subsidized wheat system, and gradually during structural readjustments, they privatize certain types of bread, but they have the subsidized bread, which the majority of the population does consume. 75% of Egyptians still use the bread. The poorest households use it on average 6.4 days a week. With the Morsi government, as a way to try to combat some of the international price shocks and to secure a bread supply, they decided they were going to move away from imports and rely heavily on domestic production. He said that in the near future they would not need to be importers. That was a failed strategy, and many of the interviews when we were in Egypt said that that was probably one of the crucial mistakes that he made. And as a result, their bread storage supplies dropped to less than 2 months, which is critically low. So here you see where we are comparing the Saudi Arabia and the Egyptian value chains, and in the red we've highlighted what are the strategic vulnerabilities. So in Saudi Arabia, it's production. They cannot grow their own wheat. And now, as they're moving towards an import-based strategy, it's also storage. When they were trying to build, or when they were trying to do domestic production, all the silos were built inland where the wheat was being grown. Now they're having to build them at the ports. Similarly, in Egypt, you have this problem of storage. Their silos are not modern, especially the government-subsidized system, creating tons of loss. Similarly, the currency reserves that they use to import the wheat internationally is being depleted at a rapid level due to unrest in the region. And finally, they're having trouble with the bakeries. Up until recent policy changes, they estimated that 30% of all bread was lost at the bakery level for a variety of reasons, from the black market to improper weight usage. So these were the major concerns. Like I said, within Saudi Arabia, the input side was very difficult, as well as the processing, and then also now bakeries are becoming problematic in certain levels. The smaller bakeries are going out of business as they're shifting and removing some of the price controls. In Egypt, you have a similar story. You have the inputs, water, seeds, and fertilizers are simply not there. When you have producers, it's hard to get from the small producers to the central markets. So you have this role of aggregator, which are these middlemen who go from farmer to farmer to collect the wheat, and then they sell it to the government in bulk. However, you see there that they get a large portion of the profits, and so many of the small farmers are unable to participate in the system in a sufficient way, and so they grow for subsistence purely. The storage and transportation leads to roughly 20% loss, and then, like I said, with the bakeries, another 30% of the domestic market is lost. So here we are comparing the changes over time from 2000 and 2014. And we see that Egypt is still relying heavily on wheat imports, but they're also trying to beef up domestic production as well. And they haven't been engaging very much with offshore production. Whereas Saudi Arabia is transferring from wheat imports, or from domestic production, which was their heavily form of procuring wheat, now towards imports. But they're also beginning to look at offshore production, which is seen as a very risky strategy.
So the important really takeaways about this is that as we look at a region or a country, and there are a number of dynamics that can impact security, food security in the Middle East is sort of it's an outcome of all of these activities that we've mentioned, but also it acts as a driver to the unrest that's happening. It's not a one driver, as we all agree, but it's definitely an important driver. When people can't access the food that they're used to buying at a certain price, it's a problem. But it's also a problem when the government can no longer afford to provide the food at that price, and it can't continue to do that. And there are a number of things, innovative things that can be done in order to address these issues. But also food security is an outcome that actually gets worse, like what we saw in the case of Syria, where the bakeries were targeted and bombarded. And then once you start having these outages in the system, the food security goes from a bad situation to acute. And then we have a different problem in this case. To add another stressor in the region with regards to the food security is all when you have these, what we would call, forced migration because of the situation in Syria or neighboring countries, Libya and so forth. These flows of people going from one country to another in the region, in already economically and socially stressed countries, adds an additional stressor to these sorts of dynamics. And we feel that it's really important to start, as we're thinking about security or social stability, or we're thinking about these countries, is to start to kind of think a little bit out of the box and look at the countries that we're looking at through the lens of the dynamics that are going on that are impacting this situation. If it's the economic situation, we're saying the young people need jobs, that sort of thing. So the next step in our research is the Black Sea piece, and that's because of the importance of the Black Sea region to the Middle East and North Africa in terms of providing food. And it's not just wheat, it's also with maize or corn, which is becoming very important as the region is starting to eat more higher animal protein. We started working on the MENA corn value chains to see what's happening in there as well, given the fact that it's now becoming really important. No one talks about it. And as a matter of fact, part of the bread in Egypt, there are these proportions where it's 70% wheat and 30% maize. And sometimes it's 80-20, but it's becoming highly important to look at the wheat value chain, the corn value chains as well. And then we are also adding the Maghreb countries, where we're looking at Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, and how that compares to the rest of the Middle East. We have several working papers on this. So there's the food security and wheat value chains in MENA. There's the shifting governance structures in the region, and that's really important because it shows how these companies are interacting and how the countries, the government systems that are in place that are actually importing the wheat. There's just a huge gap between these two systems, and we have a market failure and a government failure in this case. And then we've got the Egypt case study that we're working on. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I guess.
Now we have some time for questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, and I'll just let you know who it's directed to.
I had a question for your paper on food security and such. When you were talking about government regulation, are you talking mainly about fixed prices or fixed purchasing models? And then as well, I imagine this would apply much more in the case of Egypt or more impoverished countries than it would like Saudi Arabia. But you also have a push from places like the IMF or other large international entities that are trying to push countries away from having subsidies, so they don't view it as being sustainable. I know that's been a big issue in Jordan in particular. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that in a larger sense.
Well, once you talk agricultural subsidies, it's highly contested. So you've got the WTO and all the trade agreements. No, we've got to remove subsidies, but at the same time, we're dealing with the most protected sector, whether you're talking from exporting countries like the US, Canada, Australia, or wherever, we are protecting this particular sector. So it's a highly controversial thing with regards to subsidies and where the subsidies are going to fall, from the producer side or the consumption side. Now, to answer your question about where we're looking at in terms of government policies, you really have to look at it throughout, because we notice that the state involvement is really high across the entire chain. Anywhere, water policy, land, agriculture policy, what you plant, how you access the seed, extension services. It's really in the region, especially. I mean, we're taking Egypt because it's a fantastic example where you have production system and an high import system. But it's all the way. The subsidies exist across the entire chain, and so you can't look just at the consumption level without also looking at the other levels that are driving the consumption. With regards to consumption, though, there is a new effort that's been put out by Dr. Hanafi, who is the Minister for Supply in Egypt, which has been working so far. It looks like it's working so well with the smart card system. And this is targets, for example, the consumption side to try to lower it a little bit and to try to prevent leakage that's happening in the system. Did I answer any questions?
Yeah.
So we're looking at it from all the sides, you have to. And that's where the map is helpful too.
And I would just add that for the baladi bread, which is the main bread in Egypt, they have not touched the subsidies since 1989. And they don't want to because it puts governments in very precarious spots. And so even now with the current smart card, it's being framed as we are addressing leakages, we are addressing wastage, we are not going to take away your bread. And they're trying to make it more of a monitoring system.
It's the exact, Jordan has been going back and forth about the same smart card issue, but the black market is a much bigger problem in Jordan, so that a lot of people are afraid that they won't have access, but it's very, very simple.